To Kill a Mockingbird, a gripping story of fear, escape, and the unknown. Hook. Imagine being trapped in a world where every step you take pulls you deeper into darkness. But what happens when the very thing hunting you might not be what it seems? Stick around to discover the shocking truth that will keep you on the edge of your seat till the very last second. Don't blink. You won't believe how this nightmare ends. The night was thick with silence. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to every surface. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. A soft, uneasy creak of a wooden floorboard echoed through the dark house. Lena paused. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt it, eyes watching her. But the room was empty. Her fingers curled around the edge of the old oak table. It was cold. Too cold for a summer night. Lena swallowed hard, feeling the sweat begin to bead on her skin. She could hear her heartbeat, fast and erratic, in her ears. A low moan came from somewhere deeper in the house. The noise was soft at first, like a whisper just beyond hearing. Lena's legs felt weak. She forced herself to take a step forward, toward the stairs. Her feet moved without thought, her mind too filled with dread. The house creaked again, but this time, it sounded closer. She froze. A shadow moved across the wall. Lena turned sharply, her eyes scanning the room. Nothing. But she could feel it. Someone was here. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She didn't want to open it. But she had no choice. The door creaked as she turned the knob slowly. Just enough to peek into the hallway. The house seemed darker than ever. The only light came from a sliver beneath a door at the far end of the hall. And then she heard it again. A faint tapping, almost like footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Her heart pounded in her chest. She took a step back, but the floorboard beneath her foot groaned. A sharp intake of breath from the room ahead. And then a voice. Low. Barely a whisper. Lena. Her name. It sent a chill through her. Her body refused to move. The tapping stopped. And then silence. Too much silence. The air was suffocating. She knew. She wasn't alone anymore. The air grew colder. Lena's hands were shaking now, her heart thudding in her chest. She slowly stepped backward, but the floor creaked again. The silence pressed in. The darkness felt heavy, as if it were closing around her. A breath. Lena held hers. Someone was standing behind her. She didn't dare turn. The breath was cold, brushing against the back of her neck. Her skin crawled. Then, a soft rustling. The sound of something moving, dragging along the floor. Lena turned, her body trembling, her mind screaming for her to run. But there was nowhere to go. She was cornered. The shadow in the doorway was barely visible, but it was there. A figure. Tall, thin, almost skeletal. Its face was hidden in shadow. A low, guttural voice whispered from the darkness. You shouldn't have come. Lena's legs felt like jelly. She couldn't move. Her throat constricted, and she gasped for air. The figure took a step forward. And another. The floor groaned beneath its weight. Lena stumbled backward, her hands reaching for something, anything. The cold air pressed harder against her skin, making her shiver violently. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her chest. She collapsed to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure was right in front of her now. Its hand reached toward her. Long fingers, impossibly thin, with nails like claws. Lena shut her eyes, her whole body trembling, preparing for the worst. Then a sound. A voice. Lena. It wasn't the same voice. It was familiar. A voice she had longed to hear. She opened her eyes, and for a split second, the figure seemed to blur. The shadows shifted. The cold air receded. Lena's breath caught in her throat. A new presence stood there now. A person she knew. Someone she loved. But how? She blinked again, and the figure was gone. The room fell silent once more. Lena lay on the floor, heart racing, wondering if it had all been a nightmare. But deep down she knew. She wasn't alone. Not in that house. Not anymore. Lena lay still, her eyes darting across the room. The silence was unbearable. Every inch of her skin prickled. She could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. Her breathing was shallow, frantic. She tried to stand, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She pushed herself up, clinging to the edge of the table for support. The room was still dark, suffocatingly dark. But then, a flicker of light, a faint glow coming from the hallway. Lena's pulse quickened. Could she make it? She had to get out. She steadied herself and moved toward the door. Slowly, carefully. Every step felt like a lifetime. The floor beneath her was cold and unforgiving. Her fingertips brushed against the doorframe as if it would hold her steady. A distant thump echoed through the house. Lena froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The sound came again, closer this time. It was a rhythmic thumping, like footsteps approaching. She held her breath, praying it would stop. But it didn't. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then a creak. The unmistakable sound of a door opening. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Someone was there, in the hallway. But who? She couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor. The footsteps stopped. Silence. And then, the voice again. This time, it was clearer. Lena. Her name. It was as if the darkness itself was calling her. The air around her grew even colder. She could see her breath in the dim light. The footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate. Lena turned to face them. The figure emerged from the shadows, its shape tall and twisted. A hand, pale and gnarled, reached out toward her. The voice whispered again, but this time, it wasn't a question. It's time. Lena stumbled back, terror flooding her veins. The figure stepped forward, and the room seemed to shift. The walls pressed in. The floor beneath her buckled. Lena screamed, but no sound came. She was trapped. And the figure was closing, and Lena's vision blurred, her breath ragged and shallow. The room felt smaller now, suffocating her. The figure loomed closer, its hand still reaching toward her. The air thickened, stifling her every movement. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her pulse thundered in her ears, louder than the footsteps. Her legs were trembling beneath her, barely holding her weight. The figure's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, cold and empty. She could feel its presence wrapping around her, tightening. It was too close now. Lena's back hit the wall, and she recoiled in shock. Her mind screamed to escape, but her body was frozen. The figure's hand reached forward, slowly, deliberately. It brushed against her skin, and she gasped, a cold shiver running through her. The touch sent a jolt of ice through her veins. For a moment, everything was still. Lena's eyes locked with the creature's glowing gaze, unable to look away. Its breath was a rasping whisper, close to her ear. It's time, it repeated, the words now heavy, final. The pressure in the room grew unbearable, suffocating. Suddenly, a harsh sound cut through the air. A crash, followed by a muffled shout. Lena's eyes darted toward the hallway. Someone else was there. A flash of movement. A figure appeared at the end of the hall. Lena blinked, confusion clouding her mind. It was her brother, Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but his presence was like a lifeline. He ran toward her, his footsteps loud and frantic, breaking through the oppressive silence. The figure turned toward him, its eyes narrowing. In that moment, Lena felt the weight on her chest lift slightly. The figure's gaze never left Ethan, but it seemed to hesitate. Lena didn't wait. She pushed herself to her feet, staggering toward her brother. "Ethan, run," she screamed, her voice barely a whisper. But Ethan didn't move. His eyes locked onto the figure, the same expression of terror on his face. The creature was closer now, only a few feet away from them. Lena's heart raced. They couldn't stay here. They needed to leave. She grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him back toward the door. "Please," she whispered, dragging him behind her. The figure didn't follow immediately. But it didn't need to. Lena felt its presence pressing in on her, even as they fled. The house seemed to close in around them as they ran, the shadows shifting, watching. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. And the house fell silent again. Lena and Ethan stood outside, gasping for air. The cold night air burned their lungs, but it felt like a brief relief. They were safe, at least for now. Lena's hands were still trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced back at the house, the dark windows staring at her like empty eyes. Did you see that?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Lena didn't answer at first. She couldn't bring herself to say it, but the terror in his voice made her nod. "Yes," she said softly. "I saw it too." Ethan swallowed hard. He stepped away from the door, glancing at the shadows that seemed to stretch across the yard. The house loomed behind them, silent but oppressive. "I don't understand," Ethan muttered. Why was it here?" Lena didn't have an answer. Her thoughts were racing, her mind unable to make sense of what had happened. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to get away from here. We have to go." Ethan nodded, though there was doubt in his eyes. "I don't think it's over, Lena," he said, his voice strained. "I don't think we're safe." She turned to him, her stomach twisting. "I know," she whispered. "I know." The wind picked up, sending a chill through the air. Lena's eyes flickered to the house once more, her gaze drawn to the darkened windows. She had the distinct feeling that they were being watched. Without another word, they turned and began to walk away, their steps hurried and uneven. But then, a sound. A low creak, like the shifting of wood. From the house. Lena froze. She felt the blood drain from her face. The sound came again. Closer this time. Her eyes darted back toward the house. A figure stood in one of the windows, just barely visible in the dim light. It was there, watching them. Lena's heart raced again, but she couldn't move. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "We need to go now," he said, his voice desperate. But Lena couldn't tear her gaze away. The figure's eyes seemed to glow, faint and unnatural. It was the same creature. The same thing that had been in the house. It was still there. Lena's chest tightened as the reality hit her. They were never going to be free of it. The figure in the window didn't move. It just stood there, staring at them. Lena's legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the spot. Her breath hitched in her throat. Ethan tugged at her arm again, more urgently this time. "We have to leave," he whispered, his voice strained with panic. But Lena couldn't look away. The creature's presence felt like an invisible weight pressing on her chest. Then, suddenly, it vanished. In the blink of an eye, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the house. Lena gasped, stumbling backward. The air felt colder, sharper. She didn't want to turn her back on the house, but Ethan was pulling her now, dragging her away from the looming nightmare. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The only sound was their hurried footsteps, pounding on the gravel path. But as they neared the end of the driveway, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. A low rumble, a tremor. Lena's heart skipped a beat. The house was shifting too. She spun around, her eyes wide with disbelief. The silhouette of the house loomed darker than before, the windows glowing with an eerie light. The ground shook again, this time harder. A horrible, groaning sound came from inside the house, like something ancient and massive was waking. And then, a crack. The wall of the house splintered, cracks forming like spiderwebs across the surface. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The house was coming apart. But the worst part was what emerged from the cracks. A shadow. A shape, dark and twisting, crawling out from within. The thing from the house. It was moving toward them, its limbs unnaturally long, bending at impossible angles. Lena's legs went weak, and she collapsed to her knees, unable to look away. "Run!" Ethan screamed. He didn't need to say it again. Lena scrambled to her feet, her body moving without thought, her heart hammering in her chest. They ran, faster than before, each step feeling like an eternity. But the thing, whatever it was getting closer. She could hear its movements behind them, fast and jerky, like a predator stalking its prey. The house was alive now, shifting and groaning with each step it took. Lena risked a glance over her shoulder. The shadow was almost on them. It was taller now, its limbs stretching farther, its body distorting. And then it spoke. The voice was a low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. Lena. Her blood ran cold. It knew her name. She looked ahead. There was nothing but darkness ahead, an endless stretch of trees and road. But she knew they wouldn't escape. Not like this. Ethan was pulling her faster now, but Lena felt the weight of the creature drawing closer. Her chest tightened as she fought to breathe, but the shadow seemed to get heavier, more suffocating. With each step they took, it grew closer, its voice crawling into her mind. Lena, it's time. Lena's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. The road stretched endlessly before them, but with every step, the creature's voice grew louder, more insistent. Lena, it's time. The whisper cut through the night like a blade, sending chills down her spine. Her legs burned with the effort of running, but she couldn't stop, couldn't look back. Every instinct pulled her to flee, but something in her gut, deep down, told her that no matter how far they ran, the creature would find them. She felt it closing in, the darkness itself swallowing the air around her. Ethan, we can't outrun it, she gasped, her voice ragged. Ethan didn't answer. He was too focused, his face pale with fear. They pushed forward, but the shadows seemed to stretch longer, thicker, like fingers pulling them back. The road ahead began to twist and warp, as if it no longer led anywhere but into the very heart of the darkness. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The trees to their side seemed to lean in, their branches moving like limbs, creaking and groaning. The road was closing in around them. The whisper again. This time, it was louder, clearer. Lena. She stumbled, tripping on the uneven ground. She looked around, dizzy, trying to make sense of her surroundings. But everything felt wrong. The forest seemed alive, its shadows thick and moving. The road beneath their feet was no longer the familiar path. It was twisting, spiraling, leading them deeper into the unknown. Ethan's grip on her arm tightened, his voice strained. We have to keep moving, he said, but there was a tremor in his words. Lena wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She looked up. And there, at the end of the twisted road, was the house. The same house. The one they had just run from. But now, it wasn't the house they had left behind. It was something worse. Its windows glowed with a sickly light, the cracks in the walls widening, the shape of the shadow growing darker, more distorted. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the light, was the creature. Its eyes gleamed with malice. Lena. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, and the world around them seemed to split. The trees twisted and writhed as if in pain, their roots clawing into the earth. Ethan tried to pull her away, but the ground gave way beneath them, and they were falling. Falling.
Down.
Down into the dark, the fall felt endless, a violent rush of wind and darkness. Lena's stomach lurched as they tumbled, weightless and disoriented, the world spinning wildly. Ethan's grip on her arm tightened, but she couldn't see him. Everything was a blur, dark, twisting shadows swirling around them like an inescapable void. Her breath was caught in her throat, panic rising like a tidal wave. And then, a sudden, jarring thud. They landed with a hard crash, the air knocked from her lungs. Lena gasped, struggling to sit up, her body aching from the fall. Everything was dark. Too dark. She could barely make out her own hands in front of her, let alone anything else. The ground was soft beneath her, like wet earth or mud. Her head was spinning. Ethan? She whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Her breath caught in her chest, and she crawled forward, desperate, reaching out into the blackness. Ethan, she shouted, panic rising. A weak voice, strained and ragged, came from the darkness. I'm here. Lena exhaled in relief, though it was short-lived. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive, like the weight of the earth pressing down on them. The ground beneath her fingers shifted, soft and wet, and she recoiled in disgust. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know." Ethan's voice was filled with fear. "But something's wrong." Lena nodded, though she couldn't see him. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The air felt damp and musty, like old earth or decay. There was no sound except for their breathing, shallow and quick. Then, a soft rustling sound. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes strained against the darkness, trying to see, but there was nothing. The rustling grew louder, closer. A low, guttural sound, a growl, rose from the depths of the darkness. It sent a chill through her body, freezing her blood in her veins. The growl grew louder, turning into a hissing, like something dragging its claws against stone. Ethan's hand found hers in the dark, his grip tight and trembling. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lena didn't answer. She could feel it now, the presence moving toward them. Closer, closer. The air grew colder still, the oppressive weight of something watching them settling on their shoulders. The rustling stopped. Silence. But the hairs on the back of Lena's neck stood on end. Her breath caught as a cold draft swept through the air, sending a shiver down her spine. And then, a voice. Soft. Tinged with malice. "Lena." The name. It came from everywhere, surrounding them, pressing into her mind. The darkness seemed to tighten around her, pulling in closer, suffocating her. Something moved. Something massive. Lena's pulse raced. Her body screamed to run, but her limbs were frozen. A cold hand brushed against her face. And then, a snap. The world went dark. Lena's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. The cold hand, a sharp, unnatural touch, lingered on her face for a moment, its presence like ice against her skin. Then it was gone. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind spinning. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness around her pressed in tighter, swallowing everything. And then a sudden, harsh pull. Lena gasped as she was dragged, yanked forward by an invisible force, her body jerking violently. Her feet scraped across the wet, soft ground, but she couldn't get her bearings, her mind in a fog. She tried to call out to Ethan, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the void. The cold was unbearable now. It was everywhere, seeping into her bones, numbing her entire body. She could feel the pressure building, crushing her chest as if the weight of the earth itself was coming down on her. A sound pierced through the suffocating silence, a low, scraping hiss, like claws dragging across the stone floor. Lena's eyes widened in terror. Something was close, very close. She felt it, the air shifting, the ground beneath her vibrating. The rustling began again, but this time it was different, more deliberate. Closer, closer still. Her heart raced, her skin prickling with fear. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, barely a sound. And then, a shape, a figure, pale and tall, loomed before her. It was a blur at first, a silhouette in the dark. But then it took shape, its outline sharpening. Lena's breath caught as she recognized it. The same creature, the same twisted figure. Its face was hidden in shadows, but its eyes, those glowing, malevolent eyes, stared right into hers. The air grew thicker. The ground beneath her feet shifted, crumbling. Lena's body screamed to run, to escape, but she was paralyzed, frozen in place by the creature's gaze. Its hand, long, gnarled and skeletal, extended toward her. Slowly, methodically. She could hear its breathing now, a low rasp, each breath heavier than the last. It was like the very air around them was alive, suffocating her. Lena's chest tightened, the panic rising, and she tried to pull away, but she was trapped. There was nowhere to go. "Time," the creature rasped, its voice like dry leaves brushing together. "It's time, Lena." The words echoed in her mind, reverberating like a drumbeat. Time. Time for what? She opened her mouth to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, constricted by fear. And then, the creature moved. It lunged forward, its hand reaching for her throat, its fingers sharp as knives. Lena's pulse raced as the darkness closed in. But then, a light. A flicker, weak at first, like a distant star. And then brighter. A sound, footsteps, loud and fast, breaking through the suffocating air. The creature froze. Its eyes flickered toward the source of the light. For a moment, everything was still. And then, a voice, clear and desperate. "Lena." It was Ethan. Lena's heart surged with relief. He was there. But the creature wasn't finished. It turned slowly, its face twisting into something grotesque. The shadows around it writhed, alive with rage. "Stay away from her," the creature hissed, its voice rising in fury. Ethan didn't hesitate. He ran toward Lena, his body moving with a desperate urgency. But the creature was too fast. Its arms shot out, blocking his path. And then, a deafening roar. The ground shook, and everything around them seemed to tremble. Lena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos, her vision spinning. And then, everything went black. Lena's eyes snapped open. Her body jerked with the sudden awareness that she was no longer falling, no longer caught in the grip of the creature. She was somewhere else. The darkness still clung to the edges of her vision, but now it was different. It was as if she were suspended in it, floating, weightless. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The last thing she remembered, Ethan, the creature, a roar. But now, there was no sound, no movement, just an oppressive stillness. Lena tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, as if something was holding her down. Her eyes flickered around, but the blackness seemed endless. She could feel nothing but the weight of the void pressing against her. Then a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. "Lena?" Her name. She froze. It was the same voice. The creature's voice. But it wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It seemed to surround her, to creep into her very mind. "Don't fight it," the voice murmured. Lena's pulse quickened. The air felt colder now, sharper. Her chest tightened as she struggled to breathe. "Where am I?" she whispered, but her voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. There was no answer. The silence was suffocating, the dark around her tightening like a vice. Then a flash. A light, brief, but blinding. Lena flinched, her eyes closing tightly, but when she opened them again, the darkness was still there. The light, a faint glow in the distance, remained just out of reach. She couldn't move. Her body refused to obey her. The whispering voice returned, its tone softer now, almost coaxing. "Come closer, Lena. Come to me." Her body trembled, a deep fear running through her veins. The voice that felt like it was pulling at her soul, dragging her toward that light. But she knew, deep in her heart, that she couldn't trust it. With all the strength she could muster, Lena fought against the pull. The darkness seemed to recoil slightly, as if it were testing her resistance. "Why are you doing this?" she cried, her voice desperate. The answer came, chilling and final. "Because it's time." The words sent a jolt through her body, a surge of terror rising from deep within. And then, out of the corner of her eye, something moved. A shadow. Large. Looming. Lena turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat. It was the creature. It stood there, impossibly tall, its form shifting in the darkness. It grinned, its teeth like jagged knives. "You can't escape, Lena. You never could." A cold laugh echoed through the dark, sending a wave of nausea through her. Lena's mind screamed for her to wake up, to escape. But the creature's gaze was fixed on her, its eyes burning with an unholy light. Her body tensed, ready to fight, but she was trapped. A low rumble filled the air, vibrating through her bones. And then, a force, an overwhelming, suffocating pressure. It was pulling her forward, dragging her toward the creature, toward the light. She fought it. She struggled. But the darkness swallowed her whole. And then nothing. Silence. Lena's senses returned with a sudden, violent shock, her body gasping for air as though she had been underwater for far too long. Her heart was racing, her chest heaving, but this time, there was no darkness around her. No shadows pressing in. No creature lurking. She blinked rapidly, her vision slowly clearing as she tried to understand where she was. The air was warm, but heavy, as if the weight of the silence hung in the atmosphere. She was lying on the cold, hard ground, her hands scraping against something rough. And there, in front of her, was a pale light, a small, flickering flame. Lena pushed herself up, her limbs weak, her body aching from the fall, from the terror, from everything. The air smelled of damp earth, and there was a subtle, almost imperceptible hum, like something vibrating just beneath the surface. Her eyes darted around. She was no longer in the dark void, but she couldn't tell where she was. It was like a cave, its jagged walls closing in around her, but in the distance, there was a door. The flame came from a lantern near it. Lena slowly rose to her feet, the world spinning for a moment before steadying. Her body protested every movement, but she forced herself to walk toward the light, each step deliberate, the weight of her fear making every motion feel too slow. The door beckoned, just a few feet away, and though it seemed inviting, Lena felt her heart flutter with dread. As she neared the door, she hesitated. What if it was another trap? What if the creature was waiting on the other side? But something deep inside urged her to move forward. The lantern's light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open. Lena stepped through. But the world outside was nothing like she had expected. There was no daylight, no warmth. Instead, an endless, sprawling field of gray stretched before her, empty, desolate, and quiet. The sky above was a heavy shade of indigo, like the calm before a storm, and there was no sun, only a dull, unnatural glow that bathed everything in muted light. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The silence was deafening. And then a soft sound, the faintest whisper. "Lena?" She froze. It was the creature's voice again. It was everywhere. The ground beneath her feet trembled lightly. Lena's eyes darted around, but there was nothing, no movement, just the unyielding expanse of emptiness. Her skin tingled with the awareness that she was not alone. Something was watching her. She spun around, her heart in her throat. And then, a shape, a figure emerging from the mist. It was tall, too tall, and its movements were unnatural, jerky. The same figure from before, the same twisted being. Its eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto hers. "You thought you could escape me," the creature's voice rasped. Lena's pulse quickened. She backed away, but the figure advanced, its long limbs crawling across the ground with disturbing speed. "No one escapes," it whispered. "Not from me. Not from here." Lena's chest tightened. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body was frozen. The figure was closing in. And then, in that brief moment of frozen terror, Lena realized. She wasn't in control anymore. The realization hit her like a wave. Her body, her mind, was no longer her own. The creature's presence seemed to sink deep into her bones, its power wrapping around her, tightening like chains. It was as though the very air around her was being sucked dry, draining her will to resist. She tried to move, to scream, but her limbs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. Her vision blurred, the world around her shifting and warping, as though she were trapped between two realities. The figure loomed closer, its long, spindly fingers stretching toward her, its eyes gleaming with a hunger that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Lena wanted to look away, to flee, but her eyes were locked onto its gaze, unable to escape the pull. "Lena," the creature's voice was thick with a mocking softness, as if it were savoring her fear. "You are mine." The world seemed to twist again, and Lena's mind spun. She saw flashes of images, blurred faces, flickering lights, the overwhelming feeling of being lost. But one image cut through it all, clear and sharp.
Ethan.
His face, wide with terror, his voice calling out to her in desperation. She felt his presence, distant but familiar, pulling at the edges of her consciousness. The creature's smile stretched wider, its teeth jagged and impossibly sharp. "You cannot save him," it whispered, its voice like the rasp of dry leaves, scraping against her mind. "He is as trapped as you." A surge of cold ran through Lena's veins. She couldn't let it be true. She couldn't be the reason Ethan was lost, too. The air around her seemed to crackle, the silence broken by a sharp, ringing noise. And then something shifted. A crack in the creature's hold. It was subtle, but Lena felt it. The weight on her chest lessened, just enough for her to take a deep breath. With all the strength she could muster, she fought against it, against the force that was pulling her deeper into the creature's grasp. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms, and pushed forward, inch by inch. The creature hissed, its form flickering like a shadow in the wind. "No," it snarled, its voice twisting with rage. "You are mine. You will always be mine." But Lena didn't stop. She fought with everything she had, her mind focusing on one thing: Ethan. With a final, desperate surge of energy, she broke free from the creature's hold. For the first time since she had arrived in this nightmarish place, she could move. The figure lunged at her, its clawed hands swiping through the air, but Lena was faster. She ran, as fast as she could, the sound of her feet pounding against the earth beneath her. The mist seemed to rise around her, but she pushed forward, her mind focused on nothing but escape. Ahead, she saw something, a shape. A doorway, faint but unmistakable. Lena reached for it with everything she had, her fingers brushing against the cool surface. The door opened before she could touch it fully, revealing a burst of light on the other side. She stepped through, not daring to look back. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world around her collapsed into darkness. And then, she was falling again. The sensation of falling was unlike any she had ever felt. It wasn't just the ground rushing up to meet her, it was the very air, thick and heavy, swirling around her, pulling her downward into an abyss. Her stomach lurched, the world spinning violently, and she gasped for breath, but there was none to take. Her body tumbled, twisting uncontrollably, as if she were being torn apart. And then, as suddenly as it began, the sensation stopped. The world snapped into place. Lena's body hit the ground with a bone-shattering thud, and she gasped, scrambling to her hands and knees, her breath coming in sharp, jagged bursts. The air was thick, humid, and pungent with a scent of earth and decay. Her fingers sank into the soft, wet dirt beneath her, and she felt the unmistakable tremor of the ground. She was no longer falling. She was somewhere else. The darkness around her was oppressive, but not like before. There was no deep, suffocating void. No creature in pursuit. But there was something here. Something watching. Her skin prickled. Lena shakily stood, her legs weak, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her weight. Her heart hammered in her chest as her eyes scanned the unfamiliar surroundings. It was a forest, but unlike any forest she had ever seen. The trees were gnarled, twisted, their trunks winding in unnatural spirals, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick with a strange mist that clung to the ground, crawling over the leaves and wet earth. She could hear the distant murmur of a stream, the faint rustle of leaves, but something was off, too quiet, too still. A noise to her left, a sudden rustling in the underbrush. Lena's pulse skipped a beat, and she spun toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. For a long moment everything was still. The rustling stopped. Lena's eyes darted, her senses on high alert. And then, a figure, emerging from the trees. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, the mist playing with her perception. But no, it was real. The figure was tall, hunched over, its body shrouded in a long, ragged cloak that blended into the shadows. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood, but Lena could feel its presence. She could feel it watching her. The air around her grew colder, the mist swirling more violently. Lena took a step back, her breath trembling. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible in the stillness. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there unmoving, as if waiting. Waiting for what? Lena's mind raced, her every instinct screaming to run, to escape, but her legs felt frozen to the spot. And then the figure took a step forward. Slow, deliberate, each movement calculated, its presence looming larger, closer. Lena felt the cold seep deeper into her bones, like the figure was drawing the warmth from her very being. Another step, and then, in a voice barely more than a rasp, it spoke. Lena. Her heart skipped a beat. It knew her name. It was as though the world around her had gone silent again, her own pulse echoing in her ears as she stood there, rooted in place, unable to move. Lena. The voice was low, familiar, but something was wrong. The tone sent a shiver down her spine, as if it didn't belong in this place. The figure's hood shifted slightly, revealing nothing but darkness beneath. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out any features. No eyes. No mouth. Just darkness. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. The figure stepped closer. The mist seemed to grow thicker, swirling around Lena, choking the air, tightening her chest. "You are where you always were," the figure replied, its voice now more chilling, more menacing. Lena's body trembled. Her mind was reeling, spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. The figure raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers reaching toward her, the air growing colder with every inch. The moment its fingers brushed against her skin, a wave of intense cold coursed through her, her body stiffening in shock. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered, its voice wrapping around her like chains. "You belong here, Lena. You always have." The ground beneath her feet began to shift. The trees groaned, their limbs stretching out, their shadows elongating. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and Lena felt the weight of it crushing her. And then, from deep within the forest, a sound. A low growl, a rumbling that shook the earth. Lena's heart raced, and she finally broke free from the figure's grip, stumbling backward, desperate to move. But the mist swirled tighter around her, pulling her in, trapping her once more. She turned, frantically searching for a way out. But the growl grew louder, closer. Lena's blood ran cold. The creature was coming. And it wasn't alone. The figure's voice cut through the growing chaos. "Run, Lena," it said, its voice softer now, almost amused. "Run if you can." Lena's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled backward into the thick mist, her body trembling with fear. The growl grew louder, closer, and she could feel the ground beneath her shake with the heavy footfalls of something enormous moving toward her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her legs pushed her forward, but her feet kept slipping in the damp earth, her breath ragged and shallow. The forest was alive around her, the trees creaking and groaning as if they were watching her, waiting for her to falter. The growl wasn't the only sound now. There was something else, a whisper, soft but insistent, like the rustling of leaves or the crackling of a fire. "Run faster." The voice was familiar, and yet it wasn't. It seemed to come from everywhere, pressing in on her thoughts, urging her to keep going. But where? She had no sense of direction. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a labyrinth of twisting trees and shadows. Behind her, the growl was almost deafening now, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the ground. The figure, the dark, cloaked presence, was still there, but it had faded into the mist, its words trailing off like smoke. Lena's body was screaming for her to stop, to breathe, but she couldn't afford to. Not now. She pushed harder, her legs burning with the effort, her pulse thundering in her ears. But then there it was. A glimmer. A faint light ahead. Lena's heart leaped with a mix of relief and dread. She couldn't tell if it was real, or if it was just another cruel trick of the mist. But she had no choice. With a desperate burst of energy, she ran toward it, pushing past the dense trees, crashing through the underbrush. And then she was out. She broke through the mist, her eyes blinking against the sudden brightness. A wide, open field stretched before her. But this wasn't the safety she had hoped for. The sky above was a sickly shade of yellow, and the grass beneath her feet was withered and dry, its sharp edges scraping against her skin. The air here was heavy, thick with an unnatural heat. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she saw it. The creature. It stood at the edge of the field, its massive form towering above her. The growl had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, but the air around it was charged with an overwhelming presence. Lena froze. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to keep moving, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, piercing through the thick, oppressive air. And behind it, shapes. Other figures emerged from the mist, not like the creature, but something else. Small, twisted shapes, their features distorted, their eyes glowing with the same sickly light. Lena's breath hitched. They were everywhere now, emerging from the shadows, encircling her in this desolate, empty field. She had nowhere to go. The creature's lips curled into a wicked smile, its teeth sharp and elongated, gleaming in the yellow light. "You cannot escape, Lena," it said, its voice a low, mocking rasp. It took a step forward, its long, skeletal limbs reaching toward her. And then, the ground trembled again. A low, deep rumble echoed beneath her feet. Lena's body went cold as she realized what was happening. The field was shifting. The earth was cracking open. A deep chasm began to form beneath the creature's feet, a crack spreading wider and wider, as if the very land itself was giving way. Lena stumbled back, but the creatures, those smaller figures, advanced, their eyes glowing, their mouths twisted into cruel smiles. The chasm grew wider, its depths a yawning blackness. And then, with a sharp, terrifying hiss, the creature lunged at her. But just as it reached out, the earth beneath it collapsed. The ground swallowed the creature whole. Lena stood frozen, her chest heaving, unable to process what had just happened. The mist began to swirl around her, the figures surrounding her, fading into the darkness as the light above flickered. And then, a sound. A voice. It was Ethan. Lena's. His voice broke through the suffocating silence, clear and desperate. Her heart jolted in her chest. She turned, but all she could see was the blackness closing in once again. The mist thickened, the figures faded, and the sound of Ethan's voice echoed in the distance. She ran toward the voice. Her mind refused to acknowledge what it meant. She had to find him before everything faded into darkness once again, before the creatures returned, before the ground swallowed them both. The chasm was closing, and Lena was falling into it once again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Lena's heart raced as the world around her twisted, the ground beneath her feet trembling. She could hear Ethan's voice, faint but urgent, cutting through the thick, suffocating mist. Lena. Her breath hitched. She ran faster, ignoring the aching pain in her legs, pushing herself forward through the dense fog that seemed to pull her deeper with every step. The darkness, the eerie stillness of the field, the creature's looming presence, it all faded into a blur. Only Ethan mattered now. The mist parted just enough for her to see the faint outline of him. He was there, standing at the edge of the chasm, his face pale with fear, his eyes wide with worry. "Lena." His voice cracked. "Please." She reached out, her hand trembling as she closed the distance between them. Her fingers brushed his, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. It was just the two of them, suspended in this fragile moment of clarity. But then, the ground beneath them cracked. A deep, jagged fissure split the earth wide open. Lena's stomach dropped, and a cold, hollow feeling surged through her chest. She spun around, but the mist was swirling, thickening, enveloping them both. The chasm yawned wider, the dark abyss below beckoning. Ethan grabbed her arm, his grip tight, desperate. "Lena, we need to go, now." But before they could move, the creature's presence filled the air, heavy and suffocating. The ground trembled again. Lena looked up just in time to see the figure, a shadow of night, emerge from the fog, its eyes glowing, its twisted form towering above them. It reached for them. "Run!" Ethan shouted. They turned in unison, their feet pounding against the earth, but the darkness was relentless, swallowing them whole. The creature's voice echoed around them, taunting and low. "You cannot escape me. Not this time." Lena's chest tightened as the abyss beckoned closer, the world bending and breaking, and the last thing she saw before the light flickered out completely was Ethan's hand. Reaching for hers, the world around Lena collapsed into an impenetrable blackness, her vision swallowed by the suffocating void. Her heart raced, a frantic rhythm in the stillness, and the only thing she could feel was the pull of Ethan's hand desperately reaching for her. But the abyss beneath them was unstoppable. Lena's feet slipped on the jagged edge of the chasm, her balance faltering. She gripped Ethan's hand tighter, her fingers cold and trembling, but the pull of the darkness was relentless. The creature loomed just behind them, its voice a low growl, vibrating through the very air. "You cannot escape. You never will." Lena's breath hitched as the world seemed to tilt, a violent shift, and she knew the edge was giving way. But then something changed. The ground beneath them didn't give way completely. Instead, it trembled, cracked, and stopped. For a moment, time itself seemed to still, suspended in a fragile breath. Lena could feel the pull of the darkness, the weight of the creature's presence, but it was suddenly quieter, less oppressive. She looked around, her eyes straining against the impenetrable blackness. And there, just at the edge of her vision, was a soft light. It flickered like a distant star, faint but unwavering. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, his eyes meeting hers in that brief, fleeting moment. "Lena," his voice was barely a whisper, but it was all she needed. The fear, the uncertainty, they were gone. In their place, there was something else. Something like hope. The pull of the darkness seemed to slow. The mist faded, the oppressive weight lifting, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lena could breathe. With Ethan by her side, she stepped toward the light. The ground beneath them no longer trembled. The creatures in the distance faded, their voices dissolving into the silence. The light grew stronger with each step, warm and inviting, and it was no longer a distant star. It was a door, a path leading forward. A way out. As Lena stepped into the light, the shadows behind them disappeared. The creature's grip on their souls broke, and the last remnants of the darkness unraveled. And in that moment, the world was still, quiet, safe. Lena's hand found Ethan's once more, and together, they walked forward, leaving the nightmare behind. The light enveloped them completely, and with it, peace.